Hey, it's Mosquito, also known as Chris. Welcome to the shop. On the bench today, I've got the Blue Spruce, aka Woodpecker router plane. We're going to take a look at what it is, what it does, and how it compares to some vintage and not so vintage examples. And I'll give you my unsolicited opinion on it, and you can take that for what it's worth. Before we get in too far, a little bit of my disclaimer. I bought this thing with my own money because I wanted to. And some would say I have a plane problem. Blue Spruce and Woodpecker have nothing to do with it, and they don't have a say over any part of this video, and nobody is approving what I do other than me. Woodpecker has owned Blue Spruce now for a while. I don't exactly remember when it was that they bought them, but the router plane here is, it's also offered by Woodpecker, and it's effectively the same thing. It's the same body and the same blade adjustment mechanism, except for the Woodpecker has the aluminum handles, and on the Blue Spruce, it's got Bolivian rosewood for the handles and just a plain blade lock. So I'm making an assumption on the aluminum part for the Woodpecker since I don't have one, but Woodpecker. I will refer to the Blue Spruce plane here since it's the one that I have, but just know that the features and functionality is identical between the Blue Spruce and the Woodpecker. My personal opinion is that the Blue Spruce looks better, but I also don't have a bunch of red anodized Woodpecker stuff either, hence I ordered this one, so it would make sense that the one I have in front of me is the one that I prefer. But anyway, the price of the router plane when I bought it was listed at $270 for the plane itself, and then there's also an optional fence kit for $60. And when I bought it at release time, they had an introductory price where it was $230 for the plane and $50 for the fence. As far as I've been able to determine, replacement irons are only available through Woodpecker, and those are $30 each with no release discount. Hey, so just cutting in here because I was double checking some stuff here when I was editing the video, and it turns out Blue Spruce does now actually list both the straight and the spear point blades separately on their website as well. So it's not just Woodpecker anymore. You can get them through both. So there you have it. On the subject of blades, both the straight blade as well as the spear point blade are included with the router. It's only one post, so the post that the blade mounts on, you only get one of those. Anytime you want to switch between the straight blade and the spear point, you got to take out this little screw here, and then you can swap those around. There's no additional sizes available, just the spear point and the 1/2 inch straight. I don't see that changing at all, so if that's something that's important to you, you're probably going to want to look at a different router plane because the post on this thing is a little bit smaller than 1/2 inch by not much. You'd have to get a different post in order for that to work anyway. If you need smaller blades, you're gonna have to go with something else. Let's take a closer look at some of the features of this plane. Unlike many other Woodpecker products, this one is machined from a billet of ductile iron, and then it is black nitride coated instead of anodized aluminum. So that's probably thanks to it being cross-listed as a Blue Spruce, though. That's sarcasm. As they mentioned, the router base is 3.5 by 8.5, and it is 1/2 inch thick. A pretty hefty plane, and I do think it's pretty well made. There are countersunk holes in the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, and those are intended for a shop-made fence, should you prefer not to go with their version. I'll get to that more later on, though. Those countersunk holes do appear to be for a number 8 screw. Per the description, there are 3 different places that you can position this blade mechanism, and it can rotate in or out, so 180 degrees in all 3 of those. And those 3 locations are here, and then it can also be swapped for either of these 2 handles. That pretty much wraps up the general overview and feature list of the planes. So let's get into a little bit more detail on the actual plane itself. Like I was saying, let's dive into the actual blade mechanism itself. This is kind of the part that I don't really like but it does work well. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I do think it works well. Everything is tight, it fits really well, and I'm happy with all of that, but it's just a little bit fiddly for me. So let's take a look. You're tired of using it in the standard configuration and you want to change it to outboard. So you take the included Allen wrench, and then there is this screw underneath the blade mechanism. You loosen that up. And by loosen it up, I mean you remove it completely for all of these operations. And then you turn that around, and then you can put it back on and screw it back in place. You are in the outboard configuration. You can also rotate this blade. So if you loosen up this thumb screw on the side over here far enough, you can actually rotate this blade left or right, or completely backwards if you really felt like it. I'm going to take this all the way out, and we could take a closer look at how this thing clamps in place. So once you take that blade fully out, you can see the mechanism that locks the blade, and this goes through that block in the front here, and then it's got these grooves here that just clamp on the sides, and it always makes sure that it's facing the correct direction, and it clamps on very well. It has a very good fit. I'm pretty pleased with the fit and finish, like I said earlier, and I do like the way that this mechanism works. If we take a deeper dive on the blade here, we can see that there's this screw on the bottom of the blade, and that's what holds it into here with this little groove at the bottom of the post. But you can also see how this ends up being the same width as the iron. That's what I was saying earlier. If you had a 1/4 inch iron, it's not going to work with this post, so they'd have to get a new post for this, and there's some implications to that. So that's why I'm doubtful that you'll be able to get irons that are smaller than 1/2 inch. But to be honest, there's a decent chance that you're not going to use an iron smaller than 1/2 inch anyway, because that seems to be the most common size. But just know that the lie-nielsen, you can get an adapter for the small router plane, an adapter that uses the router plane blades from this guy in the full-size router, or you can just get a miniature router plane anyway. And then the Veritas obviously has a ton of different options for blades here that are really quite thin. This is fantastic. Look at that. It is very, very good. It's very smooth, and this fits on here, which obviously that's not in there, but that fits in here so tightly. It's obviously not a zero tolerance fit because you can't, otherwise it wouldn't move, but it does fit very well, so there is very, very little backlash. So let's take a look at how you get the blade in and out. Because the blade sits in that blade adjuster here, and it's actually this piece at the very, very top that sits in that groove that keeps it in place, you have to have a way to get it in there, since this is a rigid block that doesn't move. So they have that semicircle right there, and what you have to do is get that lined up so that it goes in here, and then you can rotate the blade to basically lock it in place. One thing to note is when you're installing the blade, if I had this 180 degrees, which I will do here. So here, if we turn the blade 180 degrees on this post, obviously it fits on there. There's no issue there. But if I loosen that up, now look what happens. If you put this facing where you want it, half of that semicircle there is going to be hitting on here, and I don't like that. So just note that when you install the blade, make sure that you do it so that you're not going to be scraping that cut edge on your depth adjuster. I mean, it's completely up to you, but I wouldn't do it. One thing that I'm not 100% sure on, and I might get the manual for it. Don't tell my wife. I will say the manual for it is actually pretty good. They do a good job of illustrations and describing things, and everything is pretty clear. Let's take a look at the depth stop and see what they say. So what they want you to do is use a 1, 2, 3 block and a ruler, and then measure it and set it. No. Okay. They show it in the directions. When you're setting up your depth mechanism here, your depth stop, they want you to tighten it on the flat of this post here rather than on the rounded part. But when I was doing that, for some reason, it seemed like you really had to crank down on it, at least on my particular plane, in order to get it to lock in place. Because if you're not careful, it gets pretty loose like this. And then at that point, you can accidentally change your setting pretty easily. So just be aware that you really do have to crank that down a little bit. But there is that 1/8 inch hex right there, so you can use an Allen wrench to fix that problem too. So I just wanted to showcase this depth stop for one of the things that I really like about it. And let's say we can pretend this is a hinge or a bracket or whatever, but let's say I've got this bracket and I want to mortise it into here so that it sits perfectly flush with this top. What I'm going to do, I think, is just kind of clean some of this out a little bit. I've already traced around it with a knife and then marked it with my chisel. So I'm just going to kind of clean up some of this to make it a little bit easier. And this is actually how I usually do this when I'm mortising a hinge or something like that, is I'll clear out a bunch of the waste with the chisel in that exact fashion, and then come in with the router plane and clean it up. So right now this blade is above my workpiece. I'm not cutting anything. So I go down until I'm just touching it. And I'll just give it one last turn. There we go. That looks really, really good. So just barely shaving. And you can certainly do this without actually having it take a shaving at all, but regardless, that's where I'm going to set it. Now we take our bracket, so horizontal piece, loosen up our depth stop, and then between here and there, so I'm basically just clamping this bracket in between the depth stop and the block here. And then we'll take that out. And now we just work down to that depth. How crazy would it be if I actually nailed this off the chisel? That would be kind of sad, actually. Oh, there we go. We're cleaning up a little bit. Exactly the problem that I was complaining about earlier. So I did not tighten this down with the Allen wrench, and with the depth adjuster, I'm able to go right past it, so I overshot. So that is why I don't really like this depth. Oh, yeah, see, look at that. It's not even tight anymore. And I tightened that thing down pretty good. I'm not a fan of the way that this is tightened, so I might end up trying to get a longer screw, because I'm not sure if that's the actual limiting factor there, but it does seem to work a lot better if you put it on one of these rounds. But then I'm worried that I'm going to mar that up and it's not going to go very nicely inside that. So it works, but it's just not as good as I was hoping. Now on the depth adjustment knob here, it is on a 1mm pitched screw, and that means that each tick, there's these little ticks here on the top of the depth adjuster, and each tick of that is a 0.002 inch depth of cut change, or 1/20th of a millimeter. So as you spin this, there's no like line on the screw or anywhere else, so it's kind of just purely reference, but it allows you to dial that in. But again, we're woodworkers. I'm not. Regardless, very nice. Everything works pretty well. So that is the outboard configuration for the middle. I'm going to go ahead and start reconfiguring some of this stuff and move it around. Here we've got a configuration where we have the blade mechanism mounted on the end, so I just swapped one of the handles in the end. And in my opinion, it really seems kind of silly. With the inboard or the outboard, I don't really see a reason why you need both ends of it to be able to be positioned. So like, to me, the 3 thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It did on like the Walkmore or my vintage plane, because on one end it's outboard only and on the other end it's inboard only, and then in the middle it could be either in or out. So that takes care of the same configurations that you could have for this for the most part. But anyway, marketing. This is a use case that I really like this for, is if you wanted to size tenons to make sure that they're exactly the same thickness or exactly the same offset from both. And that's where your depth stop might come in handy here. As I can work my way down to my depth stop on one side, flip it over, and then clean it up on the other side. That is the end configuration, and then again, you can turn that so that the iron is on the inside. And one thing that I actually really do like about the inside is if you have an edge groove and you need to clean that out with the inside, like say you're making a door or something, you can switch that to inboard. And then I actually found it's pretty comfortable to pull the plane, and it works way better than trying to balance a router plane up on edge of a board like this somehow. It's a whole lot easier to be able to just take it and go like this as you need to down the edge. So that is one area that if you use a router plane on an edge groove or something like that, it is really nice for that. That is kind of it for the depth stuff. So I think we're going to move on and we will take a look at the fence. All right, so now I've got this thing with the fence on it, and let's talk fence. So this fence, it's big. Yeah, it sticks a long way out there. So let me just go ahead and grab this here. So the plane itself is 8.5 inches wide, and these fence rods stick out another just over 5 inches off the side, and this actual fence plate is huge. So I'm not saying that they didn't do it this way because they had to, because I mean, if you're going to use fence rods and you're going to use a fence like this, like basically a plate that slides underneath the plane like this, it's going to have to be big, right? Like that makes complete sense. So I mean, I get that part of it, but man, I think I'm going to chalk that one up as I probably should have left that one on the cart. Not really a fan of that personally, because I don't use a fence a whole lot. So having something that's this big, that makes my plane almost twice as long, not really something that I need in my workflow, but it might work for you. It is pretty well thought out and it does work well. I think it's made well. You can also move these two blocks down to these other pair of holes, or sets of holes, I guess, since there's two pairs. And then you can use the fence to go around curved surfaces or curved edges by having the 2 points somewhere on here contact your workpiece instead. So it is a good idea that if you're going to use it with something like that, having this fence, it'll get the job done for sure. I'm just not so sure I like how big it makes everything. Here you can kind of see that little V-notch in the actual fence rod itself, and that's important because that is where this screw would end up holding that rod in place. So this gets put in here, and then you tighten that screw down, and it'll hold that in place. And it does a pretty good job of that. I don't have any complaints about how any of that works. If it's for you, it's for you. It just doesn't really seem like it's for me. So here's kind of one of the annoying things. Look at this. Now, in order to make my router plane fully functional and do anything I need to it, I have to have all these Allen wrenches laying around, and I'm not a big fan of that. This one came with the actual fence itself. It's a longer Allen wrench, but somewhat dumb. It only works these counterboard screws here that hold these blocks in place. Why couldn't we have made that the same size as the ones for this? Annoying. The thing I don't like about it, it's these middle-sized, or this middle-sized one of the shorter ones, which seems fine, except if you wanted to actually tighten this thing down, now I'm running my Allen wrench right on top of my handle. So you get to here, and we're not even close to tighten down. In fact, I can probably still get the fence rod in and out. Yep. And I'm hitting my handle here. So not a fan of that, because that's going to scratch up your handle. So either you're going to have to sit there and, you know, keep taking it out and putting it back in and turning it that way, or just take this off, install your 2 fence pieces, and then put this back on. It's probably going to be faster, to be completely honest. And then to keep beating that dead horse, you're going to need both of those. If you were looking to install the fence, I've already got this back rod installed. Again, there's the one end that has the groove on it here, and that goes in to the actual plane, and then you've got your screw here. I have the knob removed because it's a lot easier, as I just explained, and that's how you put that on. I did find when you use this the first time, it's better to leave these a little bit loose, because then when you slide them on to the actual fence rods, you can make sure that you can slide it all the way in, because if they're not perfectly aligned with the rods, it might jam up when they get closer to the plane, where these don't have as much room to flex. Otherwise, they've just got some thumb screws on top. They lock in the fence, and that feels pretty solid. Like, I've used it a couple of times on a few different test pieces over here, and it's never slipped, and it's never felt like it's going to slip. So it definitely works pretty solidly that way, and I'm happy with the fit and the finish of it. I just will say, again, it's a little bit clunky for me in terms of how large it is, how much space it takes up, and how much it adds to the actual plane itself. And again, it annoys me that that Allen wrench that they give you, it's going to hit this thing, or you're going to have to take it off. So keep that in mind if that's something that you're going to care about. It's, like I said, a little bit clunky feeling, but it certainly gets the job done. One issue that I did just discover is I was going to leave these 2 fence screws here just so that I wouldn't lose them, because these are a lot smaller. These I'll always know where they go because they're pretty bespoke to the plane itself, but this is just a pair of screws, so those would be really easy to misplace. And so I thought, hey, I'll just put them in there, I'll tighten them in so that way I don't lose them. Well, the problem with that, they ever so slightly stick out the bottom, so that's not going to work. Just to circle back a little bit, you can put these fence rods on either side of the plane. There are provisions for mounting them on both of those, as well as if you wanted to move the cutter into one of the end positions, there's also the slots and the countersink here for mounting the fence on one side of the plane. You can pretty much set that up however you might need to. It's just whether or not you want to do that for $60, or if you want to just kind of make your own. Before you start complaining like, hey, they couldn't really have done it any other way, blah, blah, blah. So the Walk More, which this is not the fenced version. Obviously, I don't have a fence for this thing. They had a version of this along with the first version of the Walk More planes that they made that actually has more like a Stanley, or I think Lie-Nielsen and Veritas kind of do it that way too, where they have a groove in the bottom and then you can just screw into the fence from the top, and that's able to slide in and out underneath the plane. It's definitely something they could have done here, and I would love to see a future revision where they were able to accommodate something like that rather than having to use this fence. I don't know if that fits in with the way you work or not, but that's just kind of the way that I work. It's not really something that I see myself using a whole lot, so chalk that up to the wish I would have left it there. Live and learn. I bought it so you don't have to. So what does all that mean, all that talking? Well, I like it. I still think it's a good plane. I do really appreciate how well it's made. One of the things that I was a little bit disappointed when was honestly the packaging, which kind of sounds like a stupid thing to be complaining about, right? But it was basically just a bunch of parts thrown in some bubble wrap bags and then tossed in a shipping box along with a set of instructions. But it just didn't feel like they were done. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, hey, we got this router plane made, we got all the parts, here it is. Yeah, just throw it in the box and let them put it together. The other thing that kind of bothers me is actually the bottom of the plane, and I can guess why. It's probably cost related, but the bottom is milled, so it's not smooth, where like the Walk More, for example, has been smoothed out. The blue Spruce, it's got the coating on it, which is fine. I don't care about the coating, but you can still see where they milled this thing flat. So there's actual mill grooves on it. so I don't know how well that's going to actually pick up on camera, but you can actually see where the tracks of the milling cutter are. So you can kind of see the half circles, and there's a line down the middle. And the line down the middle isn't something that you catch your finger on, but you can feel the roughness that way versus this way is not as rough. So you can definitely feel it. And I guess technically speaking, that'll end up helping a little bit with the friction too, but it just doesn't feel finished. Like, to me, I would have rather have seen that ground so it was nice and flat. There's some other pieces to it. So like these edges here on the bases of these knobs, they're sharp. Like they're not rounded over, they're not smoothed, anything. They're pretty sharp. And that's something to note when you're handling this thing, is that could be something that could get you if you're not careful. So I'll probably end up rounding that over with a file at some point. When I first got mine, this depth stop, there was a burr from when they had threaded it. So where this little thumb screw is, they had threaded that through, and the burr was just left there. So I couldn't actually turn this off of one of these flat spots because physically that burr on the inside would hit it, and I couldn't move where it is. And I also feel like that thumb screw could have been a little bit longer, because the issue that I've been running into is I can tighten it as much as I can on that flat, and it always ends up not having a really good tight fit on it. So if I'm using the depth adjuster, I can just push right past it, and it's fine with that. But I might end up getting a little bit longer screw for that, just to try to avoid that problem, because I'd really rather have this clamp on a flat rather than clamping on the actual round part, because that's what registers in this block here. So other than that, at $270, this is kind of sitting at the top of the current new router planes, I believe. So, because I think the Veritas is 200. I think the Cat's Moses is 230, but generally on sale for around 210. And then the lie-nielsen is 250. And so 270 bumps it up to the top, but I think it's worth it. I think this is a much better plane overall than any of those three. And that's not to knock any of those. I've actually never used a Cat's Moses before, but the Veritas I've had a chance to use, and the lie-nielsen I've had a chance to use back when they used to do hand tool events around here. But I love the Preston style plane. That's why I ended up with 3 of them, right? Like, they're just, in my opinion, a little bit more versatile and just a nicer plane overall. It is a little bit bigger than like a Stanley. This is actually a keen cutter, but it's effectively the same thing. So it's a little bit bigger, but I just love the versatility of them. Being able to change the positioning of the iron to the end and be able to do tenons a lot better. I just really kind of fell in love with this when I first got this isn't actually a Preston. An actual Preston would cost like 4 or 5 times what this does, which is a little ridiculous. But this is one of the many clones from back in the day. So this was my first one. And then when Walkmore started making these again, I picked one of those up because I just really like this form. So I don't think you can go wrong with this plane. Personally, I would probably skip the fence. I don't think I would do that again if I was going to buy another one. I don't think I'm going to buy another one. But if I were doing it over again, I'd skip the fence. I don't think I would do that just because it doesn't fit into my workflow. It might fit in yours, that's up to you. But really the only complaints that I had were the somewhat rough finish on some parts, like the bottoms of this being kind of sharp, and then the burr on that depth stop collar thing. And it still bugs me that this isn't actually ground flat. So basically, to sum it all up, I really like this plane. I think it's worth the $270, but if there's one thing that I've learned from Woodpecker acquiring Blue Spruce over the last however many years that's been, don't buy it at full price if you don't need it now. Because they seem to have an awful lot of sales where they put stuff on sale. So that's kind of the one thing I've learned with Blue Spruce now, is now that they're a part of Woodpecker, you don't want to be paying full price for stuff. So $230 at that introductory price, if it goes on sale for that again, this is a great buy, because that's cheaper than the lie-nielsen. We'll call it the same as the Cat's Moses, and it's like $30 more expensive than the Veritas. Granted, Blue Spruce is usually pretty bad about the shipping costs, so factor that in, and it's about the same price as the lie-nielsen. I still think it's worth it though, just don't get the fence unless you know you're going to use it a lot. So just to sum it up, I don't really like the fact that this isn't ground flat. There are some sharp, rough edges on like the bottom of the handles and on that depth collar, at least on my example. And then I'm not a fan of having all these Allen wrenches kicking around, but that is the plane in a nutshell. I appreciate those of you that stuck around. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below and I will see what I can do. I could do a follow-up or a short or just reply to comments or something. If there's something that you want to see me do with the plane, something to try, I can certainly do that. I kind of skipped over a lot of the in-use examples. I just sort of did some stuff to make sure that I had used it a bunch before I actually started talking about it. But I did a full review of this Lock-More plane where I kind of went into depth about some of the functionalities and how you can use that plane, and it very much overlaps. So anyway, I appreciate those of you that stuck around this far, and I will catch you in the next one. I'm not Wayne, but I'm starting to feel like I've got a router plane problem.